Each have two puppies in a row. Was he born sailing? Going to
What is it? PowerPoint?
And I never saw him.
Talk about.
Predator management? Not really anyone interested. So short. Yeah, right.
Of the 100,000 native carnivores that are killed in the U.S. by USDA Wildlife Services, about 70 to 80,000 are coyotes.
We have an all-out war on coyotes in this country, and so far all it's succeeded in doing is making more coyotes.
Do you hear them? And it's a sense of wildness around here. There is an intrinsic value to that.
We
Of
couldn't
the
get the volume of
100,000
sound
native
from
carnivores that are killed in the U.S. by U.S.
this. So we just pulled it off the birds and put it.
We can try. Does it have an HDMI port? No.
So you're going to do the presentation on here, the video here, is what you do?
If that's what, if I don't have a choice.
Okay, yeah. Or just what's there? Are you going to play the video? Just switch on that. And during this part of it, you just on the laptop.
So let me just set up for this.
Yes, I'll be here. I'll stay here.
I'm going to go set up the moves.
Sorry.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I wish we could do that.
Okay.
So you have that's great.
All right. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Destroying Wildlife, the War on Predators panel. We have two speakers. We have Camilla Fox and Professor Dan Rolfe. Camilla Fox is the founder and executive director of Project Coyote, a national nonprofit organization based in Marin County, California, that promotes compassionate conservation and coexistence between people and wildlife through education, science, and advocacy. I'll let her tell you in more detail about that. And then many of you know Professor Dan Rolfe. He teaches wildlife law, law science and the environment seminars, sustainability in the law and business, and other courses in the law school's environmental and natural resources program. He also works with the law school's LLM program. He's the co-founder of the Pacific Environmental Advocacy Center, which is now the Earthrise Law Center, the law school's domestic environmental law clinic. All right, so first we have Camilla Fox. Thank you and good morning. So I'm going to be focusing my talk this morning on predator management or mismanagement in the United States, with a focus on a little-known agency known as USDA Wildlife Services, getting to be more known, and I was pleased to see that it was a central featured piece in the ALDF newsletter that's in all your packets this month. So I'm going to start with a little history of predator management in the United States to put the situation that we're dealing with today in context. So, ever since we stepped foot on this continent, we have viewed large carnivores as a threat to both livestock and to the species that humans hunt for game. When settlers first colonized the eastern seaboard, they saw the large carnivores, the bears, the wolves, the mountain lions as a threat, and have systematically trapped and shot those animals since the very beginning. As early as 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed the first bounty on wolves, paying professional trappers and hunters to kill wolves. And then by 1915, Congress became officially involved in predator eradication campaigns when they allocated $125,000 to the USDA's Bureau of Biological Survey to essentially systematically eradicate large carnivores throughout the western domain public lands. So then in 1931, Congress became officially involved in predator control efforts when they passed the Animal Damage Control Act. This act essentially authorized the Secretary of Agriculture to promulgate any method for eradication, suppression, or control of large carnivores. And this act remains virtually unchanged today. Under this act, massive amounts of poison bait were spread across the West. Essentially, they would take carcasses of sheep and cattle and lace them with various toxins such as compound 1080, thallium, sodium cyanide, incredibly destructive to both target and lots of non-target animals. And it ultimately led to the extirpation of a number of species that are now listed under the Endangered Species Act. In a 50-year period, hundreds of thousands of large carnivores were eradicated throughout the West, and by the 1950s, many of these different large carnivores were extirpated from their original range. Professional scientists with the American Society of Mammalogists have repeatedly condemned this large-scale killing of large carnivores by our federal government. First in 1930, when they passed a resolution calling the Bureau of Biological Survey the most destructive organized agency that has ever menaced so many species of our native fauna. Then again, in 1999, they passed another resolution, this time condemning the next iteration, and it's actually gone through a number of iterations. The Bureau of Biological Survey went through various name changes, then became the Animal Damage Control Agency, and that was under Fish and Wildlife Service. It's now euphemistically known as Wildlife Services under USDA. So this resolution in 1999 reiterated those same concerns about the cruel and indiscriminate methods that were being employed that were also affecting many non-target species, including threatened and endangered species. And they urged the agency to cease indiscriminate preemptive lethal control programs and to focus on the implementation of non-lethal control strategies, compensatory measures, and sound animal husbandry techniques. This was a letter sent by then President of the ASM, Dr. Michael Mayers. This was sent to USDA Wildlife Services, highly publicized letter in 2012, essentially outlining those same concerns, and through FOIAs obtained the information on targets and non-targets killed, and outlined over a 10-year period how many native carnivores were being systematically destroyed by this agency. Again, they reiterated those same concerns and encouraged Wildlife Services to redirect its efforts at research into holistic management, especially non-lethal methods, which acknowledges current ecosystem science and the value of top-down control by apex predators. And this has been one of our primary concerns with this agency, is that they really do not value the ecological role of predators in any of their programs. And this is a huge failure on the part of this agency, because as we've come to know through conservation biology, apex predators are absolutely critical for healthy, resilient ecosystems, yet our federal government does not put this valuation in their EAs and environmental impact statements. So this same year, spring of 2012, investigative reporter Tom Knudsen did an explosive expose of Wildlife Services. He spent 18 months investigating this agency through FOIAs, interviews with whistleblowers, looking into their practices, their policies, and this is one piece in the first of the series. It was a front page cover story in Sacramento Bee, and I encourage you to check it out online because it really goes into great depth about the concerns with this agency.
He says, according to Wildlife Service's own records, the agency has accidentally killed animals more than 150 species since 2000 and has mistakenly killed more than 50,000 non-target animals not considered threats to agriculture, using light hole traps, wire snares, and poisons. Among these animals are federally protected species such as golden and bald eagles, as well as over 1,100 dogs. And the agency makes it incredibly difficult to get their actual information. Aside from doing a lot of redacting, trying to find out costs for their programs is incredibly difficult. And these aspects are being challenged increasingly by both animal protection and conservation organizations. So this was one of the photographs in a photo gallery accompanying the series, showing, and we worked with Tom on showing the animal cruelty that some of these employees were allowing to unfold in the field, particularly with the use of their own dogs, where they would allow their dogs to attack various trapped animals. In this one, you see 3 coyotes caught in leg hole traps at top and foreground await death in this photo taken by a Wildlife Services trapper in Nevada. The coyote in the foreground is being attacked by the trapper's dogs. Leg hole traps are used by the agency to capture and kill 10,000 to 12,000 animals a year. Subsequent to that series, a number of members of Congress called for an investigation by the Office of the Attorney General, and they specifically asked that the agency be investigated for lack of transparency and lack of accountability. We then, about 1 year later, Project Coyote led an effort with 12 other NGOs, including ALDF, CBD, NRDC, HSUS, to meet with the Secretary of Agriculture and Wildlife Services to also share our concerns about the agency and this lack of accountability, lack of transparency. And one day before that meeting, the New York Times came out with an explosive editorial condemning the agency, agriculture's misnamed agency, and also mentioning the fact that Representatives Peter DeFazio and John Campbell had asked for an investigation into the agency. They also cited Tom Knutz's series and also cited a publication of one of our Science Advisory Board members' piece in Conservation Letters, where he really uses science to challenge the practices by Wildlife Services. So interestingly enough, when that came out, we got a call from Wildlife Services. I got a call from them the morning of our meeting saying they would not be present at the meeting that we were having with the USDA. So it was very interesting that we think that they were finally called to the table, and subsequent to this, the OIG has commenced an investigation, and that investigation is supposed to be completed early this next year. So I'm going to now shift to a case study of Wildlife Services in Northern California. And the way that Wildlife Services functions is they enter into contracts between counties and the federal government. Essentially, these contracts provide money from the feds to the county. That money then goes and pays for a federal trapper whose job it is to control native carnivores, largely on ranch lands. So you can imagine this is quite an incentive for counties to contract with the agency. They've been doing it since passage of that Animal Damage Control Act. And it's very hard to actually kind of wean counties off of that because they've been so used to the federal subsidy. So in Marin County, we learned in 1996 that that deadly poison called compound 1080, this is a poison that was developed in Germany. It was found to be very toxic to not only rodents but also wild canids. And our federal government started using it as a predicide in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. First in that kind of bait that I mentioned, and then that was actually banned by the Nixon administration. And some people are not aware that under the Nixon administration, we actually had some of our most far-reaching environmental and conservation laws passed. And so under Nixon, he banned, EPA banned the use of compound 1080. And then it was brought back for use in this what's called a livestock protection collar under the Reagan administration. And the idea is that the collar is filled with 2 bladders, and when a predator attacks that animal, the bladders burst and the animal dies. It takes about 4 to 12 animals for the average coyote to actually die. Incredibly inhumane and So we learned in 1996 that Marin was going to be one of 3 counties in Northern California to experiment with this poison, Sonoma and Mendocino also. And we actually formed a coalition of conservation and animal protection groups to challenge this. And it led to a real investigation as to, what was this agency? What were they doing in our county? What other animals were they killing? How many tax dollars were they using? So we learned that all of these predators were being killed by the agency, particularly on West Marin ranch lands, and again, at taxpayer expense. So we then met with our Board of Supervisors, our coalition did, in a series of meetings, and he directed our County Ag Commissioner to do some mediated meetings between both sides, both the ranchers and the conservation groups and our coalition. And essentially what we did through that process was we identified areas of common ground, and that was in the community's support for agriculture, a recognition that we need native carnivores for healthy ecosystems, and some of the more enlightened ranchers recognize that their predators are actually good because they help to keep the rodent populations down on their ranches. And then a recognition that Wildlife Services really wasn't working for the community. Even some of the ranchers were complaining that the Wildlife Services trapper didn't check his snares and other devices in a timely manner and by state law, which in California is every 24 hours. And then, probably most importantly, there was a commitment to explore alternatives, to see if there was something that we could do in place of poison and in place of lethal control. So our county went to USDA Wildlife Services and said, we'll continue to contract with you, but only if you don't use poisons in our community and you use lethal as a last resort. And Wildlife Services refused to abide by those modest guidelines. They essentially said, we want our whole toolkit, and they expressed concern that if Marin did this, that other counties would follow suit. So that's when ultimately our Board of Supervisors said, we're going to do it a different way. We're going to end our contract with Wildlife Services, and we're going to adopt a non-lethal program. So we worked with them, with the County Department of Ag, to develop this non-lethal cost share program. And I should mention that during this time, as I mentioned, this started in 1996, we generated a lot of media attention and publicity around the whole Wildlife Services issue. The DC office was involved because they were very concerned about a county pulling out of their contract. And the public exposure, particularly around this poison, led to passage of Proposition 4 in 1998 by California voters, which ultimately banned sodium cyanide, compound 1080, and the use of body-gripping traps for commercial and recreational trapping. So this non-lethal program essentially took that county subsidy and it put it into a cost share program. And what this does is it assists ranchers with implementation of non-lethal methods. So guard dogs, llamas. I did a talk a couple nights ago, and 2 people in the audience says, what does a llama do? So I decided to include a clip at the end so you can see a llama in action here. So it also improved fencing and then night corrals, among other non-lethal techniques. And so the program is now in its 14th year, and what's most important probably is critical evaluation of a program like this, because of course Wildlife Services is constantly challenging this and saying it's not as good as our program, it's not cost effective, doesn't help reduce livestock losses. Well, this is straight from the mouth of our County Ag Commissioner, who does do evaluation of the efficacy of this program. And he says that losses fell from 5 to 2.2%, while program costs fell by over $50,000. For the first couple of years, we couldn't tell if the loss reductions were a trend or a blip. Now we can say there's a definite pattern, and livestock losses have decreased significantly. So I then went back to grad school, and I did my master's thesis doing a comparative analysis between Wildlife Services and this non-lethal program. And I used 5 years of data to analyze, and I had basically 8 questions that I looked at, and these are just some of the conclusions. We have and actually now we have about 100% participation from commercial ranchers, sheep ranchers in Marin with the program. And the qualitative analysis that I did for my thesis found that there's preference for the non-lethal program over the USDA traditional predator control program. as you just saw from Stacey Carlson, substantial reduction of livestock losses, definite increase in non-lethal deterrent use, and a reduction in the total number of predators killed. And so one of the things that we have really been looking at, both at a local level and national level, is how do we scale these models up? And how do we get wildlife services to shift from this lethal approach to a non-lethal approach? Because they have been just stuck in this status quo really since 1931, which has been focused on these indiscriminate lethal methods. So I'm a firm believer that we have to hit this agency at all levels, from the federal to the state to the local, and we have to show models that work. And so one of our goals is now to really scale this Marin model up. And with this goal in mind, we've started on creating a film around this. I have a short trailer to show you here, and we're ultimately hoping to make a 30-minute piece that we can get on PBS. So hopefully this will work here. Let's see, do I have my AV yet? Press this over here.
Of the 100,000 native carnivores that are killed in the U.S. by USDA Wildlife Services, about 70 to 80,000 are coyotes.
We have an all-out war on coyotes in this country, and so far all it's succeeded in doing is making more coyotes.
Lethal control is largely ineffective, and in most cases it only make the problem worse.
And we kill hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them in horrible ways.
Many of these animals are killed with indiscriminate lethal methods, including aerial gunning, snares, poisons.
Well, I don't see any use in killing all the animals. I mean, they all need to be here for one reason or another.
By eliminating, the alpha male or female, you could actually upset the apple cart, so to speak, and create more coyotes being produced.
If you were to remove all the predators, not only would the environment suffer, but you would throw the ecology completely out of balance. You can never do just one thing. That's one of the first laws of ecology.
So anywhere from killing a few to killing many just opens up Pandora's box. They have so many tools and so many ways to compensate for that lethal control.
So in 1996, we learned that this federal agency was going to be using a poison called Compound 1080. None of us knew what it was. None of us knew about the agency that was going to be using this.
Well, the Marin County Livestock and Wildlife Protection Program kicked off with the controversy around using 1080 collars for predator control.
In addition to Compound 1080, Wildlife Services use another deadly poison called sodium cyanide.
My dad used the cyanide devices here, and whatever animal tugged on them basically was killed. My experience was that you either got a young coyote that probably wasn't the problem, or you got an innocent bystander, so to speak, a fox or something like that.
Millions of innocent animals that are actually helping our ranching and helping our land are being killed indiscriminately.
So when we learned about this poison and the agency behind it, we then learned that this agency had been functioning in Marin County for decades at taxpayer expense. And they were already killing bobcats, badgers, mountain lions, foxes, particularly at the behest of ranchers.
Animal groups interested in protecting wildlife came forward and asked that we try non-lethal approaches.
And this includes livestock guard dogs, llamas, better fencing. Here was assistance to help them mitigate livestock losses and to obtain, methods that they had never previously employed before.
Part of my job as a farmer is to figure out how to coexist with the wildlife. And I really don't like shooting and trapping and killing various animals that I think we ought to share the road.
I believe today we have 40 guard dogs out on 20 plus ranches, and we have, I think, 35 llamas. Livestock losses from predation has markedly declined. When USDA Wildlife Services was in the county, the total program cost was around $80,000. Since they have left, the program costs have declined down to around $20,000.
The Marin County Livestock and Wildlife Protection Program is just becoming a national model for how to do it right. There's great reduction in depredations. It's become cost effective, And ranchers and farmers have been really much more involved with the natural functioning ecosystem, and the more they learn, the more they can improve those kinds of non-lethal control practices. If you want to keep an ecosystem healthy, you've got to have the whole carnivore complex. You've got to have predators and their prey.
If there were more counties that adopted this and actually implemented it on a serious level like we did here in Marin, they would find that they could be successful as well.
We need wild animals. We need all kinds of wild animals, and the more different kinds of wild animals we have, the better.
You know, when the coyotes are singing outside, I always, turn off the stereo when we hear them. We turn off the stereo and open the windows and say, listen, do you hear them? And it's a sense of wildness around you. If there is an intrinsic value to that.
So I just did an interview with Peter Coyote a couple of days ago, and we're going to pull him into this movie with the hope that we'll scale it up and get it to a much larger audience. So we're excited about that. And I just want to mention, in terms of the scaling up, that we're working right now with the Animal Legal Defense Fund on this front, and ALDF last year, sent a letter to the Sonoma Board of Supervisors, essentially challenging this contract and challenging it under the California Environmental Quality Act and also the Public Trust Doctrine. And the Board of Supervisors responded and essentially didn't renew the contract. So huge kudos to ALDF for doing this. And we're now working with some ranchers in Marin and Sonoma to test some new predator deterrence and to ultimately look at this non-lethal approach. So we're hoping collectively that we can really start to promote this alternative way. We're also together, ALDF and several other organizations sent letters to 2 other counties in California using the same legal challenge, the California Environmental Quality Act and the Public Trust Doctrine, to say that, your renewal of this contract is a violation of the Public Trust Doctrine. You have not done that kind of environmental analysis that I mentioned at the beginning of looking at all those aspects, because Wildlife Services relies on an outdated environmental impact statement that they did, I believe, back in 1997. They have not redone that, and that EIS relies on very arcane science and peer review literature. So we have argued that they need to redo that EIS, if not supplement it, and that really they need to be looking at the big picture here, that we need large carnivores, we need these animals. This is a violation of the public trust, and we're hopeful that doing this at a local level, challenging at a local level, can really be scaled up at a state and national level. So I encourage you, if you're budding attorneys, to look at this, to also look at the Public Trust Doctrine, because I really think that this is an area that we could be using more. I also think that we could really be using laws like the California Environmental Quality Act to challenge these kinds of things. So I encourage you to partake in that. I'm going to end with, actually, I mentioned the little video of the llama, so I'm going to share that with you. This is a great little BBC clip, at least I hope I am. Let me, I'll check. This may be more work than it's, for whatever reason, it's not recognizing my videos on my computer here, so bear with me 1 second here. Okay, I don't think this is going to work. Oh well, you don't get to see the llama in action. AV challenges are always just, we shouldn't have PowerPoint, but anyway. So I guess I'll end with a quote from our, oh no, okay. All right, we're not going to worry about it. I'll end there, and I'll be happy to talk more over Q&A.
So can you put my... Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Dan Rolfe. I'm a faculty here at Lewis & Clark. I wear, as you heard in my introduction, I wear a couple of different hats. I teach quote-unquote regular law school courses right in this room, for example. This is one of my favorite rooms to teach in at the law school. But also I work with our domestic environmental law clinic, Earthrise Law Center, and in that capacity I work with students on real-world litigation. My specialty generally is endangered species litigation. So I'll try to draw on both of those areas for my talk this morning. I love listening to Camilla's talk about coyotes. They're one of my favorite animals. Occasionally one will. And one of the amazing things about coyotes, I think, is they're so adaptable, including in the urban environment. Probably, as most of you know, the longest running study on coyotes anywhere in the world is centered in, anybody know? Chicago. That's the longest running. They have GPS collars on a whole bunch of coyotes. Their territories are delineated by streets. They cross with the stoplight, literally. They're really smart animals. Very cool. Occasionally, we're fortunate to see one walking down our street, and if I wake up in the middle of the night, sometimes I can hear the yips that you just heard on the video or on the audio just in the park down the street. So.
I saw one actually on the way this morning on Terwilliger.
Yes.
Back right at me. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so.
And it's fascinating actually because a lot of the things that Camilla, I teach an urban biodiversity course as well, and a lot of things that Camilla's talking about, including coexistence and non-lethal management of coyotes, is a pretty significant issue in urban areas as well. And we've had those discussions in the city of Lake Oswego, for example, just down the hill. For years, their policy was let's shoot as many coyotes as we can, and they recognized that was a dumb policy. And in fact, a fairly conservative mayor, after he was really looked into the issue and became educated about it, really became an advocate for living with urban coyotes. So, cool story just down the road. I am going to talk a little bit more generally about predators, and my overview is, well, the title of our talk is The War on Predators, and this isn't a particularly good time to be a predator in the United States. And I'm going to look at a few reasons that I think might explain that, what the consequences of that are, and perhaps what we can do about it. Well, if you remember that far back to this movie, the 21st century seemed like a really cool place. Right? We were going to be super high tech, and we were going to be discovering new worlds. We were still going to be wearing bell bottoms, apparently, as we walked around in our spaceships, but fashion was apparently not as updated. But well into the 21st century, it seems a little bit more like the 19th century. Especially from a predator perspective, than this advanced society of the 21st century. I can't tell you how many times I get email alerts from various organizations about the latest hunting derby. The last few years, it's oftentimes aimed at wolves. Idaho especially seems to love this kind of thing. But a wide variety of other predators as well. When we think about this kind, when you look at that kind of a scene, you usually think of, sort of sepia-toned old pictures, right? And how can we look at these sorts of pictures in the 21st century? What is going on? To quote, anybody know who that is? Of course. I think there may be a few things that this far into the 21st century explain what's going on with predators. I call this the Sagebrush Rebellion redux. We saw earlier this year, we saw a pretty stark example of that when a rancher in Wyoming who had been literally flouting federal law and regulations for years and overgrazing federal land without permits, finally had his cows rounded up by the BLM, and that prompted, this huge, crazy, armed posse, essentially, of people descending on this area, and, standoff with the federal officials ensued, and this sort of rhetoric takes over. A frustration to some degree by Western states in particular that have a large percentage of federally owned land in the state, oftentimes frustrates officials and residents of those areas because they very much resent things like having to get permits to graze on federal land. People see that as a right rather than a privilege, and when the federal government says you can't graze off everything on the land because that destroys wildlife, destroys its ecological value, those people just don't quite see it that way. They're like, yes, we can. All this grass is ours for the taking. All of those predators should be eliminated because they might eat a cow. You may have seen just last week that went to Washington, D.C. There were a bunch of ranchers that rode across the country from Nevada and camped out essentially in front of the White House. So that Western anger from many of those conservative Western states is really at a boiling point once more. Extremism now doesn't seem so extreme. I think we've seen this in politics across the country in many ways with the Tea Party. We see a nice crossover here with politics and wildlife policy with our friend here on the left, kind of mirroring both worlds. And, these days, what many hunters in the past would see as ridiculous, even hunting. Things like bear baiting, there in the upper right. Things like coyote and black bear denning. The state of Alaska, for example, has an Alaska game board. And starting in about 2002, which in the last decade, I think we've seen in many ways a rise of extremism in a lot of forms. And in Alaska, certainly this particular board became much more extreme in 2002 and started trying to enact all sorts of policies that allowed even these very extreme hunting techniques. And just last week, for example, the federal government finally moved to try to restrain some of those methods of hunting on federal land and national preserve lands, where the feds moved to ban bear baiting and bear and wolf denning, hunting and spotlighting. Like one type of spotlighting, they go out at night and find black bears hibernating in their dens and shoot them. For many hunters even would think that is a crazy policy. But the state of Alaska, sort of running my Sagebrush Rebellion idea together here, when the federal government said, we're going to ban this practice on federal preserves, national preserves, the state of Alaska, sort of threw a political hissy fit. So that's the kind of thing that we're seeing in the 21st century. Now is a good time to talk about what otherwise seems like a dry topic of federalism. What's the relationship between the federal government and states? I think increasingly we've seen the federal government being very, very solicitous and deferential and maybe even capitulatory to states. You get this rhetoric of partnerships. I can't tell you how many federal officials I've spoken to, and they're like, we're all about partnerships. We're all about partnerships. And to some degree, what that translates to is whatever the states want, we have to go along with it. And in wildlife policy, we're seeing some pretty amazing things that now the federal government, even under a Democratic administration, is capitulating to states in amazing ways. So, for example, the Fish and Wildlife Service is moving toward letting the state of Florida authorize take, killing, or injuring of all endangered species. Authorized by the state without the involvement of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Unheard of until now. Let's see, what are some of the other things going on? Yeah, the state in North Carolina, for example, we'll talk a little bit about red wolves and killing of red wolves. One of the things that, speaking of coyote management, again, one of the things that the federal government is trying to do is capture and sterilize coyotes and put them back into the environment as essentially a red wolf conservation measure, because there's some hybridization between red wolves and coyotes, and so that's an important measure to try to cut down on coyote reproduction. And the state of North Carolina is not very favorable to red wolf conservation, and so the state of North Carolina has said, okay, federal government, we're going to cut you off on the coyote capture permits. And so the federal government is potentially, the Fish and Wildlife Service is potentially looking at shutting down the red wolf recovery program in the state. Well, why, some of you attorneys might ask, why is the federal government even getting a state permit? Can't the federal government act without a state permit? I think the answer is pretty clearly yes, but because they're partners and they emphasize partnerships, the Fish and Wildlife Service is saying, we can't do something if the state doesn't want to do that. In Texas, maybe the most amazing example, I think, unfortunately recently upheld by a federal court too. This is an Endangered Species Act permit. The Fish and Wildlife Service decided not to list as endangered, even though it had proposed to list this species, the dune sagebrush lizard, and it decided not to list that in Texas because the state of Texas had come up with what the Fish and Wildlife Service called an adequate conservation plan for the species. Well, this being Texas, one of the interesting elements of the Texas State Conservation Plan is that the land that's enrolled in this conservation plan, where habitat for these lizards are going to be protected, is secret. The Fish and Wildlife Service can't know which properties are going to be protected for the lizard, because that would violate the property and information rights of the landowners. And the Fish and Wildlife Service said, okay, we'll sign off on this secret conservation plan. As long as the state of Texas says that's okay, our partner is somebody we have to trust. Kind of crazy, probably unheard of, even under previous Republican administrations. Policy also plays a significant role, I think, in what's going on with predators. This is the wolf range, the range of wild wolves in the lower 48 states in 1996. Guess what the recovery range? In 1996, wolves were listed as an endangered species. So guess what the recovery range looks like for wolves in 2014?
All 48.
Where we want to recover wolves?
Oh.
Where's the Fish and Wildlife Service decided it wants to recover wolves? What does a recovered wolf population look like? This is what we started with in 1996 when wolves were reintroduced in the West in central Idaho, in this small area of central Idaho, in this small area around Yellowstone National Park. Some wolves still existed here in the upper Midwest, some wolves, maybe a few wolves in northern Washington, some wolves in the northern Rockies and Montana. So, this was almost 20 years ago. What do we want the range of a recovered wolf population to look like? How much more of that white area are we going to color? Answer, none! We want the range of a recovered wolf population in the lower 48 to essentially look like what it did 20 years ago. Why is that? Well, you have to look into a policy interpretation recently finalized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service under the Endangered Species Act. There was a good New York Times op-ed about this. Speaking of New York Times op-eds, about a month ago. Somewhat obscure, but leverages really important questions with respect to predator conservation like wolves. The ESA defines an endangered species as... Killed it. I was trying to use a little laser pointer, but there's the laser pointer.
Great.
In show, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, just hit next one.
Pointer options. They shouldn't give me technology. Okay.
Yeah.
Yay! Okay. Thank you. All right. The Endangered Species Act defines endangered species as a species in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. All right. Sounds fine. But what does that really mean? A species endangered throughout all or a significant portion of its range. What was the historical range of gray wolves?
Almost all of them.
Almost everything you see up there. What is the current range of gray wolves and red wolves? Essentially what you see here. Okay? Historic range, current range, very, very different. So, here's an interesting question. In this definition, endangered species in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. What does range mean? Is it current range? Does this definition refer to current range? Or does this definition refer to historic range? Does that make a difference? Makes a huge difference, right? Because if we're saying, is this species in danger throughout a significant portion of its historic range, what's the answer? Of course it is! It's in danger of extinction. In fact, it's extirpated throughout most of its historic range. But if we say, is this species in danger of extinction throughout a significant portion of its current range, what's the answer? It's doing pretty well within its current range. And guess how the Fish and Wildlife Service interprets the definition of range, current range. And so that allows the agency to say, here's our recovery plan for wolves in the Northern Rockies, for example. We want to have at least 150 wolves there, 150 wolves there, 150 wolves there. Beyond that, they're all excess wolves. Congress legislatively delisted gray wolves in the Northern Rockies. The first and only species thus far ever delisted by an act of Congress. So this species is no longer endangered. And why can Idaho have wolf hunting contests? Because a recovered wolf population is defined as having at least 150 wolves in those three relatively isolated areas. And that's defined essentially as a recovered population under the game. So policy makes a significant difference. Another interesting issue really has come up more and more now in the 21st century. Some people call, in fact, Lewis and Clark, the college just had its environmental symposium last week about the Anthropocene, an era when humans dominate the environment. And so in the Anthropocene, we're starting to see this issue come up more and more. If we have salmon in the Columbia River Basin that are endangered, whose fault is that? Or if there aren't as many elk as we would like to see and we would like to hunt, whose fault is that? Well, increasingly the answer is it's predators' fault. Sea lions eat too many salmon. Wolves eat too much big game. Cormorants eat juvenile salmon. And we're acting accordingly. This is something that's going on right now at the Corps of Engineers here in the Northwest. The Corps has a draft environmental impact statement out on the streets to go out and shoot about 4,000 pairs of cormorants at the mouth of the Columbia River because they prey on juvenile salmon. And we're trying to increase juvenile salmon survival because we have 13 species of salmon and steelhead that are listed as threatened or endangered in the Columbia Basin. There's no doubt we have conservation problems with salmon in the Columbia Basin, extended ones. But is it really cormorant's fault? Or perhaps should we look at ourselves a little bit more closely? Similarly, many states, Alaska included, especially, Alaska has shot hundreds, if not thousands, of wolves from helicopters and such in the name of increasing big game available for hunters. And other states, such as Idaho, justify their wolf policies in a similar vein. Again, not looking to the impact that human activities have had on those species, but looking at predators as our competitors that are interfering with what we want. Well, what can we do about this 21st century war on predators? Well, in a couple of weeks, there will be an event all over the country that can make a major difference in a lot of these issues. As somebody once famously said, elections have consequences. And they certainly do. at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, to the extent that we send people like that woman whose picture was up to a governor's office, for example, you can predict pretty well what sort of predator policies we're going to see. And so, this is not rocket science. Everybody in this room knows about this, but I think there's room for the environmental community, the animal community to be even more cognizant of elections at all levels. And I say that because my next possible solution is we need to think, people who advocate for predators need to think at levels that are important. And as I mentioned, the federal government is being ever more solicitous of the states. The states have a huge amount of authority over predator management and all wildlife management. And I think animal groups and environmental groups for too long have really mostly played at the federal level. We'll go talk to the feds, they're more reasonable, they'll listen to us, they've got a lot of power, they've got a lot of money, and so that's oftentimes where we focus on energies. Well, guess what? The feds have a lot less money than they used to have, which is another problem. Things like the sequester, when agency budgets like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service get slashed. The feds have less money. The feds have less influence. They are very solicitous to the states. So perhaps we should really look more closely at the state level. And I think if there was some really focused advocacy at that level, we could potentially see some change. Because, supported advocacy at a state or local level, I think, as Camilla pointed out, can educate people and can actually lead to more enlightened policies, even in states that initially may be somewhat reluctant to do that. I think an interesting example, that it's not exactly benefiting a predator, but it actually does benefit predators to some degree. It's related to what Camilla was talking about with wildlife services. The state of California banned lead ammunition. Passed state statute banning lead ammunition, phasing that out by 2019. Huge measure. It's going to protect innumerable, to the extent that it actually gets implemented, it's going to protect innumerable species, including species like bald eagles and especially California condors. It's really huge. And the California legislature and the governor sort of bravely enacted that over the opposition of very powerful interests such as the NRA, for example. So if that sort of thing can happen, it's California. And so maybe it's easier to pass that kind of thing there. But that sort of focused advocacy, I think, at the state level can really bear fruit. We all need to participate. We all need to take advantage of opportunities to be a voice for predators, to say we think wolf recovery, for example, means something more than just tiny museum keeps populations scattered around the country. Here's another sad issue when it comes to predator management. In North Carolina, coyote hunting is apparently very popular. People like to do it at night for reasons I really don't know. And the state makes that perfectly legal. Well, if you go out trying to shoot coyotes at night, what might you shoot instead? Wolves, red wolves. Even during the daylight, red wolves often look very much like coyotes, and making the distinction can be quite difficult. At night, it's usually virtually impossible. And with the state allowing those sorts of night hunts, a lot of red wolves were being killed. What put a stop to that finally? That's what put a stop to that. Animal groups with environmental groups together got together, filed a lawsuit under the Endangered Species Act, a Section 9 lawsuit saying that by allowing night hunting, the state of Carolina was taking action that resulted in the killing or injuring of red wolves, and a federal judge granted them a preliminary injunction. Right now, I haven't heard what's going on up to the minute, but the last time I heard, the sides were actually getting close to coming together and reaching an agreement that would essentially eliminate night hunting. Not all coyote hunting, but it would eliminate night hunting and therefore pretty substantially protect red wolves. So, support your local public interest attorney, even if it's just donating some food here and there. But in that instance, the war on lawyers can be a part of the war, an important battle in the war, in the war on predators as well. People like this guy, anybody know who that guy is? One of my favorite people. I got to speak, I got to be a witness at a House Natural Resources Committee meeting that he chaired. Believe me, if you're representing an environmental perspective, being a witness at any committee meeting this guy chairs is no fun whatsoever. That's Doc Hastings. He's in Congress. He's a representative from Eastern Washington. He was a big term limits fan about 16 years ago. Sort of tells you once he got elected what he thought of term limits. He's been leading the charge against wolves, against predators generally, but also against environmental attorneys. So in a bill that the House passed this summer, when they were in the Senate, fortunately, but that may not be true after the next election and what happens with the Senate. One of the things that this guy is really on his high horse about is trying to get rid of fee recoveries when environmental and animal groups win in court against the federal government. So for entities like our environmental law clinic, those fee recoveries are really crucial to be able to fund our operations. And without those fee recoveries, that could potentially put us out of business, and that's precisely what Doc Hastings wants. So finally, this is my preferred view of the 21st century. And I hope that, perhaps through some of the solutions that I suggested, we can try to get there. I teach sustainability law as one of the things, and I think thinking about what sustainability law is interesting. Some scholars suggest that it's more cooperative, that it's more innovative. I think those are good ideas. If we can look for cooperative and innovative ways to coexist with predators, I think Camilla's talk was a great example of that. There are other examples, including with wolves. The Defenders of Wildlife has a Wood River wolf project in central Idaho that is doing many of the things that Camilla talked about with respect to coyotes, non-lethal control and avoidance of predators, and that project is also, like the Coyote Project, been quite successful. Received national recognition. So that, I think, is the sort of innovative, science-based, forward, cooperative kinds of approaches that should be the most common in the 21st century. And I think we get there. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to take questions now. We have about 25 minutes for questions. So if you have a particular question for a panelist, maybe address them or both of them. Just go for it.
So I have a question for you. I was surprised to hear about the conciliatory attitude of the federal government towards the states. Now, I didn't know that this was a trend, and I was wondering what brought this up, because we have this huge military-industrial complex that the federal government channels most of its money towards. So to me, I just thought that the federal government was becoming more powerful. But so is it bifurcated in terms of projects, or how do you explain that?
Well, I think with respect to wildlife and predators in particular, and I think perhaps environmental policy generally, there's always been federalism issues. There's always been this kind of tug of war between the states and the federal government for authority. And in wildlife, it's particularly challenging because the states were the traditional managers of wildlife. And so historically, the federal government just basically let the states manage wildlife, period. In the West, that's somewhat challenging because if the states are managing all the wildlife, much of the land in the West is federal. So you have the federal government managing the habitat and the states managing the wildlife. And so that sets up a real tussle right there. And then increasingly, as the federal government enacted wildlife protection statutes, like the Endangered Species Act, like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, you layer federal control over birds and wildlife, including predators like wolves, were listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So suddenly, the states couldn't exclusively regulate wildlife because the wildlife was listed under the Endangered Species Act, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has significant management authority there. And so that, again, led to this tussle between the states and the federal government. It's interesting to see, like I said, under a Democratic administration, the feds being less willing to use that federal power, like the ESA or the Marine Mammal Protection Act gives the federal government, with the Supremacy Clause especially, pretty much carte blanche control to the extent that it wishes to take it. But if I were to hazard a guess, Barack Obama, frankly, just doesn't care that much about land in the West. Wildlife and predators, not a big deal. Not a huge priority for that administration. So I think the political calculus has been, we want the states happy with us. A lot of the Western states' delegations are Republican. We want them to have one less thing that they're mad at us about. And so we'll be increasingly solicitous toward the states when it comes to managing wildlife. Political calculation.
Yeah, go ahead.
Professor, could you speak out to the role that you might see for the private public interest firm? Here you talked about the nonprofit clinic, and we've heard a lot about the donor base of big environmental groups being a factor in their decision making. What about the role for the small private public interest firm that doesn't have to depend on donors and contributions, but can fund a litigation docket through some other means that's compatible with animal rights or environmental protection?
Well, sure. It's always an interesting question, right? Contrary to public belief sometimes, I can't tell you how many calls our clinic gets. I'm like, can you take this case for me? And it's just some land use case, and people call you up and expect you to do the case because, environmental lawyers work for free, right? Gosh, it turns out that, even though I'm an environmental attorney, people still send me bills and, I still have house payments. It's like, wait a minute, I'm an environmental attorney. No, I have to pay my bills too. So, somebody's got to pay the bills, right? You can get contributions toward paying the bills. That's one way. That's, our clinical model to some degree. You can have your clients pay you. If you can find clients that pay you, terrific.
Maintaining the public interest side of the firm, but using private like a civil litigation firm. So this is what I do. My private side is personal injury practice, and then it's also works in like employment type model, and then working in the civil rights side. Are you seeing, that seems to be like a sort of trend, a sort of thing that was up and coming in about the 80s and 90s that seemed to have fallen off the radar a little. I just wondering.
Maybe, it is really interesting to see how different attorneys who want to do this kind of work, who want to do great public interest work, pay their bills and do that. Some like you and many, or at least some of our grads, they make money doing one thing and do good for the world on their own, essentially. And that time, you could probably make twice as much money, right? If you spent all of your time on paying sort of clients, but you don't. You make enough to pay your bills, and then after that, you work on a pro bono basis. It takes special people to do that. And, our law school has been fortunate that we have a lot of those people. But that's you can tell me more stories than I can, because I live in a different model of funding. But that's a tough way to make a living. You're really juggling things, trying to do enough to pay your bills over here and working on the cases that you love over there. That's hard. One of the ways that people can do that is if the public interest side of your practice involves litigation against federal agencies, that can oftentimes be fee recovery. But, people like Doc Hastings know that. They know that if they cut off that fee recovery, it's going to be much more difficult for that public interest bar to do what they do, because we all have to pay our bills. And so, so he's smart. He's like, I'll go after that, and that'll cut down on all these lawsuits. Now, he doesn't happen to mention that nobody gets, the public interest bar doesn't get paid anything unless they show that a federal agency was arbitrary and capricious and acting illegally. And so we should reward that, right? That lawyer showed that the federal government was acting arbitrarily. We should reward that. But if you're Doc Hastings, you essentially want the federal government to be acting arbitrarily against private interests. And so he wants to.
Madeline.
So this is actually for both of you guys. I started an environmental and animal law society in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I'm just wondering, so when I road tripped here, just transferred here, and on my way, actually, I passed a picture that you had put up that was very similar. It was a farm, and there was like 100 dead coyotes, and or red wolves. But so, do you guys have any suggestions on? We've got some connections with state agencies down there. Do you have any any ideas on how I can get involved in this process? Because you said that it hadn't gone through yet, and they were still in the works.
Get who involved?
Sorry, so that because we have 45 active members, and we've got some good connections with some different agencies, but I don't think that they're doing anything in regards to this matter. So do you know someone that they can contact, even somebody they could write a letter to, or anything?
Are you saying North Carolina?
Yeah. It's in Greensboro.
Well, one of the things that he mentioned is getting involved at the state level. And so everyone, all of our state agencies have a rulemaking process.
Yeah.
I will say North Carolina is not an easy state on this front. They're fairly hostile to red wolves, to coyotes, to anything with fangs and claws and anything that's not hunted for game. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be involved. So I think absolutely at the state level is a place to get people active. Historically, our voices have not been loud at all at these state wildlife agency meetings. They've been dominated by consumptive wildlife users. I think it's an area that we really could improve upon, and I encourage all SCALDOF chapters to encourage their members to be part of that, because they don't even advertise very often proposed rules that would have great impacts on not just predators but non-game. So that's
your
just one
agency
area.
have a presence in North Carolina?
We, our nonprofit, Project Coyote, we're national, and we don't have a representative down there, but we have been involved with the various groups that did the lawsuit that was just discussed, and we are involved with a number of nonprofits down there, so certainly, I welcome you to get involved with us, and we would get you active on some of these fronts.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. I think Animal Welfare Institute is one of the organizations that's involved
Defenders, yeah.
in that issue. One of our alums, Tara Eduardo, with AWI, has worked directly on that. And so, if law students, sometimes there are small organizations or even individuals or whatever that would love to help those organizations advocate at places, like the Fish and Game Commission in North Carolina, but they just don't have the ability to do so or the knowledge. So if law students were really helping them out, I'd love to have the commission meet and all of a sudden look out there, and the majority of people there were like, we want more red wolves.
And I'm going to
We don't
speak to
wanna
that
see
because
coyotes.
we're doing that in California, and I absolutely believe that is, it's so challenging on the wildlife front at the federal level. And as you know, we are so often in reactive mode as opposed to being proactive. And I really do feel at the state level we have an opportunity. In California, we're actually starting to turn that around. We have a president of our commission who's actually involved. He's Audubon, and he's forward thinker. We have a vice president now who also is forward thinking. So we have a majority vote right now in California, which is very rare for a state wildlife agency. So I totally agree that, if we could get the ALDF chapters around the country and get some of, all of you at these agency meetings, we could start to turn it around. Right there.
So, except, this is where I get confused, maybe you don't understand. I've been involved with mostly wolf recovery for many years, probably 30 years, and originally came from a zoo background, an extensive zoo background. And it seemed, of course, through the years I've made some progress, and of course gone back and made some progress and gone back. And then the picture you showed of the current wolf recovery, of course, we haven't made much progress at all. What's interesting to me is that you're saying that the states hold a lot of the power, and that's probably the direction that we can gain a foothold to make changes. Except, once the wolves were delisted and the power was given back to the states, in many particular states where wolves are found, hunters and ranchers hold indiscriminately an inordinate amount of power in those states, and they're basically making all the decisions for predators, in particular wolves. Whereas if you talk to the average person, the average public, they feel that predators have a role, and an important one, in their states, even in states like Montana and Wyoming. So to me, it's very hard not to get discouraged after a while, because it feels like, because they have such a big voice, the ranchers and the hunters, the average person, the average public is not being heard. So how do you reconcile that to those two different ends of the spectrum through the states? I don't, because the states themselves, once they took back that power, immediately started with the derbies and the hunting contests, and we only want 150 wolves per state. So I struggle with how that's helpful, if that makes any sense. Like how to get that power through the states when it doesn't seem to be. In fact, we seem to have gone back to the 1600s instead of making any progress. Does that make any sense?
I'll jump in here. I'm sure we both have. But absolutely, I'm not saying this is at all easy. And California, is often leads the nation and is very different from Idaho and Wyoming and all the wolf states you mentioned. One of the conundrums, I mentioned the public trust doctrine, our commissioners, Board of Game, they are ostensibly the trustees of the public trust doctrine. And yet, we see invariably them not actually doing that properly as true trustees of the wildlife resource that's supposed to be there for all Americans. So it is definitely a challenge. That said, I think that we have to have a voice, not just present at the meetings, but when there's open public comment period. So I'm going to give an example right now. He mentioned the Idaho Derby, the Predator Derby. We brought attention to that when it happened last year. That was the first time that wolves were also targeted in addition to coyotes post their delisting. Right now, they just reopened the public comment period, the Bureau of Land Management, because the proposal is actually also on federal lands, Bureau of Land Management lands, and including wildlife WSAs. So there's a public comment for all Americans to say something now. And in the scoping comment period, we got 56,500 comments generated. We've been getting this out along with other nonprofits across the country. I'm sure that the period, this comment period, will generate over 100,000. They just extended it by a week until the 23rd. So we have an action alert on our website, projectcoyote.org. But this is one way, and actually it's an interesting kind of discussion with the state, because the Idaho Fish and Game actually has a policy that states that they're against killing contests, that it's unethical. So we're using that, and actually one of our Science Advisory Board members, Dave Parsons, just last night at the Wilderness Conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the Idaho BLM director was there, and he posed this question to them and said, how can you allow this on BLM lands when the Idaho Game and Fish has a policy against killing contests? And he actually got him because, BLM does defer to the states in general in terms of their wishes, and yet here is the Idaho Game and Fish, and I wanted to talk to you over lunch over this because he said, pose this question to you. Here we have Idaho Game and Fish with a policy against killing contests, BLM deferring to them, and then the BLM saying, we defer to the state. So he didn't exactly know how to respond to this. But getting back to your point, I think that it is a real conundrum. I think that with the state agencies, we have to look at the constituency of the commissions, their funding sources. I think we really need to change those. And, our approach is to try to create models, just like the Marin model. We're hoping to create a model in California of actually reforming predator management, starting with the low-hanging fruit, which we view as things like killing contests. And then hopefully, ultimately, shifting the constituency of the commission, and then shifting the funding sources. So I know I mixed a little bit of oranges and apples there, but there's some overlap.
No, I totally agree with all of those things, and I also sympathize with that dilemma. But, I think some of this goes back to the leaders of animal and environmental organizations and the strategies of those organizations. If it's actually true that there are a large number or even maybe a majority of average people, and even in places like Idaho, that don't like wolf killing contests or something like that, well, that ought to be an opportunity, right? And that ought to be taken advantage of. Somebody, so if some organization said, look, in Idaho, the majority of the people don't really like this. Let's organize that. Let's use that as a tool. Let's go into Idaho and try to make those average people's voices heard. I think that sort of a campaign might go somewhere. But again, I think historically, environmental and animal groups have not really focused much on the states. And so that would take resources, that would take organizing, that would take a lot of effort in those states. And most groups have been like, Idaho, are you kidding me? But maybe it's time to say, in Idaho, we've got to do that. Also, issues like funding. I talk about this a lot in my wildlife blog posts in this very room. Follow the money. All right? Where does virtually all of the money from all these state fish and game agencies come from? It comes from hunters and fishers. Period. And so who do these state fish and game people listen to? They listen to hunters and fishers. What's a potential response to that? What's an antidote to that potentially? All of us who buy binoculars, hiking boots, all that sort of stuff, if we paid an excise tax like hunters and fishers do on their equipment, that money under federal law it's collected by the feds and it's given by the feds to the state fish and game agencies. And there have been lots of proposals to tax binoculars, hiking boots, backpacks, that kind of stuff, and have that money also go to state fish and game agencies for non-game wildlife management. And so suddenly, if some of the budgets of the Idaho Department of Fish and Game or Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife are coming from non-hunters and fishers, you're starting to change the perspective of the agencies, even just a little bit, and that would be huge. And guess what? There's a lot of support for that. And the only thing that's killed that, there's bipartisan support for those kinds of excise taxes going to fund non-game management at the state level. And the only thing that's killed that has been, read my lips, no new taxes. That's been the only thing that has killed that, which is crazy because everybody wants it. And so working for something like that can start to change.
And just on the heels of that, a number of states, Arkansas, Missouri, have done actually a sales tax, and they did it back in the day before you could actually get probably a sales tax, and this goes through now, but I think it was 0.1%, specifically to go into non-game. And it commenced because of non-consumptive users, us, saying, we need a voice, we need to put more money into the coffers so that we can also have equal footing with the consumptive wildlife users. So I think it's an absolutely critical thing that we look at creative ways. Montana also just proposed a wolf stamp. So this is actually something that the State Wildlife Agency suggested to allow people to actually buy a wolf stamp to put into the coffers of the state agency, ostensibly for that money to go into non-lethal ways of mitigating conflicts between livestock and wolves, and also essentially for wildlife, non-consumptive wildlife users. But there's a lot of issues that come into play with something like that, and organizations have brought that to the Montana Fish and Game Department, that you can't pass something like this and not put provisions that's not going to go in and basically support the status quo and the lethal control. There got to be very, very well-defined parameters around the use of that money. But it is absolutely something that we should be looking at as the funding sources and ultimately the commission base.
Okay, we have time for probably one more question. Go ahead.
Where do the fees go for conservation plates? They go to conservation agencies typically?
They vary, for example, California has an endangered species plate. We have multiple different plates, and they really vary. It depends on the specifics around the actual plate and process and all that. But often it will go into to a state endangered species enforcement agency. But those are also, that's just yet another mechanism. It's, license plates.
Well, thank you to our speakers so much.
And I also make myself available to anyone who wants to talk further, and do check out our website. And if you're interested in getting involved in things like the Predator Derby, the Wildlife Services issue, please join our E-team, which is right on our homepage, projectready.org.
And I think it's lunchtime, and lunch is going to be in the LRC, which is outside. It's a different building. It's across the amphitheater. So, have a good day.
Coming back.
You're going to go on your own little dirty rampage. It really does it should be like speaking.
Yeah, I need to go get food so I can go.
at the art room at like 1:15. So yeah, talk to her and then I'll do that. I'll see you soon.
I forgot to mention that today too. Since I bought